The bouncer's hand tightens around Bianca Rachel's waist, and he has no idea he just touched the one thing Pedro Salas would burn the city down for. 5 seconds from now, that massive body in the security shirt will be on his knees, but right now he's smiling, thinking the envelope in his pocket makes him powerful. The music is still playing, and Pedro just walked back in. If this story pulled you in, go ahead and subscribe so you never miss what's ahead. I've got another unforgettable story coming tomorrow. And while you're here, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. I love seeing people tuned in from all over the world. Okay, let's get back into it. The club is alive the way certain rooms only come alive after midnight. Purple light bleeds across the ceiling in slow, deliberate waves. Bass rolls through the velvet couches like whether you feel it in your chest before your ears register it. Champagne bottles arrive at tables with sparklers attached. Brief explosions of gold light that illuminate faces for half a second before darkness reclaims them. The air is thick with cologne, ambition, and the particular confidence of people who've never had to check a price before ordering. This is the kind of room that belongs to a certain kind of person. Pedro Salas is exactly that kind of person. He walks in the way men walk when they've stopped needing to prove anything. Black tailored suit, no tie. Collar open just enough to show the edge of the tattoos that climb his neck. Dark ink against pale skin. Deliberate and controlled. The same way everything about him is deliberate and controlled. His hands carry the same marks. He doesn't scan the room when he enters. He doesn't need to. He simply arrives, and the room quietly rearranges itself around his presence without being asked. Beside him, Bianca Rachel owns the other half of every eye in the building. The red dress isn't performing, it simply is. Form-fitted, elegant, the kind of red that doesn't shout, it declares. Her auburn hair falls past her shoulders in waves, and she moves through the room with the posture of a woman who has sat across negotiating tables and won, who has walked into rooms full of powerful men and left with what she came for. She is not Pedro's accessory. She is not his decoration. She is the other half of something formidable, and the people who know them understand this without it ever being said aloud. They take their usual VIP table. Pedro's men stay at the periphery near the entrance, at the edges of the floor, outside the front. No cluster. No visible muscle flexing. This is how Pedro has always preferred it. Subtlety is not weakness. Subtlety is what separates the people who last from the people who don't. For 30 minutes, the night is exactly what it should be. Then a figure approaches the table, leans in low, speaks quietly beneath the music. The men you've been tracking. I believe they're inside tonight. Pedro doesn't move immediately. He sets his glass down with the same unhurried motion he does. Everything measured. Never reactive, but something behind his eyes shifts. Bianca catches it. She always catches it. The rival crew, the one that had been bleeding through the edges of his operations for weeks, quiet, surgical, moving like men who believed patience would eventually make them invisible enough to strike. They'd been dismantling supply lines, buying influence in corridors he'd held for years, testing the edges of his city as though testing the temperature of water before climbing in. Here, tonight, inside the one room in this city that should have been untouchable, Pedro stands. He turns to Bianca, takes her hand in both of his, presses his lips once to her fingers, not theater, just reflex, the way people touch the things they mean to protect. I'll be right back. She holds his eyes for a moment, nods once. He walks out with 2 of his men. Outside, a phone is produced. Photos scrolled. Faces cross-referenced against faces already filed in the back of his mind. Confirmed. All of them confirmed. Pedro gives a single instruction, quiet as the space between heartbeats. Find them. Nobody moves until I say. He turns. He walks back inside, and that is the 30 seconds that changes everything. Because while Pedro was outside, someone else inside was making a decision. One of the rival crew had watched Pedro leave, had seen the window, had spotted the shift change that brought a new face to VIP security. A face that didn't know the room, didn't know the history, didn't know the landscape of power written invisibly into every table in that section. Simon Davila had transferred to this floor less than an hour ago. He is a large man, broad through the shoulders, thick through the arms, the kind of build that has always made the world feel manageable. He'd worked security at 3 venues before this one. He had never had a problem that his presence alone couldn't resolve. In his experience, size was a language, and he was fluent. The rival sat down beside him at the bar, didn't make eye contact, just placed a thick envelope flat on the counter and slid it sideways with 2 fingers. Woman in red. VIP table. Bring her to us. Simon looked at the envelope, looked at Bianca, looked back at the envelope. She's a guest, he said. VIP. The rival added another fold of bills on top without blinking. She'll come. Simon Davila is not the villain of this story. He is something more ordinary, a man who saw money and mistook it for permission. He tucked the envelope into his jacket, straightened his security shirt across those broad shoulders, and walked toward the table where Bianca Rachel sat alone, champagne glass in hand, completely composed. Miss. He stopped at the edge of the table. Someone at the back wants to meet you. Bianca looked up slowly. Her expression didn't shift. No. Simon paused. 1 beat. 2. Then he reached forward and closed his hand around her waist. She rose immediately, standing not in compliance but in resistance, her voice cutting clean through the music. Let go of me. He didn't. His grip tightened. He began moving her toward the edge of VIP. Glasses paused midair at nearby tables. Conversations fractured. Eyes turned. The music kept going. The lights kept pulsing. And then the door opened. Pedro Salas stepped back inside. His eyes found her in less than a second. Found Simon's hand. Found everything. He stopped mid-stride. The club lights rolled purple across his face, and in a voice so quiet, it somehow carried over all of it. The bass, the crowd, the music, he said. Leave, my girl. The music kept playing. That's the thing nobody who was there that night would ever forget. Not the sound of what happened next. Not the crowd's reaction. Not even what Pedro said. It was the fact that the music kept playing through all of it. Bass rolling, lights pulsing. The rest of the world completely unaware, while 5 seconds quietly rewrote everything Simon Davila thought he understood about power. Simon turned slowly. The man standing 15 feet away wasn't what he expected. Pedro Salas wasn't tall in the way Simon measured tallness, wasn't wide the way Simon measured width. He wore a black suit with his collar open, tattoos climbing his neck, hands visible at his sides. He wasn't moving fast, wasn't moving aggressively. He was just walking forward, calm, precise, like a man crossing a room he already owned. Simon's grip on Bianca tightened instinctively, not from cruelty, but from the particular stubbornness of a man who doesn't yet understand that the ground beneath him has already shifted. Relax, Simon said. His voice came out steadier than he felt. She's just going to meet someone. Nobody's getting hurt. Pedro stopped 3 feet away. He looked at Simon's hand on Bianca's waist. Looked at it the way a man looks at something that doesn't belong where it is. Then he looked up. You have 3 seconds to remove your hand. The words weren't loud. They weren't theatrical. They landed the way certain truths land, without decoration, without volume, without any need for emphasis, because the weight was already in them. Simon almost laughed. Almost. Because this was still, in his mind, a situation he controlled. He had 6 inches and 80 pounds on the man in front of him. He had a security shirt and a position of authority, and a room full of people who understood what that combination meant. 3 seconds, Pedro repeated, and something in Simon's chest moved. Not fear exactly. Something closer to the first moment of uncertainty, the first crack in the glass before the whole thing gives. He didn't release her. Wrong decision. Pedro moved on the 3rd second. Not explosively, not the way men move in films, with wind-up and effort and visible intent. He simply closed the remaining distance in 1 step, and his hand found Simon's wrist, the same wrist attached to the hand still gripping Bianca. Simon tried to pull back, didn't move. Pedro's fingers wrapped the joint with a precision that had nothing to do with strength, and everything to do with knowledge. The specific, studied knowledge of exactly where a wrist becomes a lever, where the body's own architecture becomes its vulnerability. He rotated downward. 1 motion, controlled, efficient. Simon's arm locked at the elbow. His shoulder followed. His entire body had no option. Physics had already made the decision for him. He felt his knees buckle before his brain fully registered why, and then he was going down. 1 knee hitting the polished floor of the VIP section, with a sound that cut through the nearest conversations like a blade. Bianca stepped sideways immediately, composed, unhurried. She smoothed the front of her dress with 1 hand and stood 3 feet back, watching. She didn't look frightened. She looked like a woman who had just watched the correct thing happen. Simon tried to push upright. Pedro applied the smallest additional pressure, a fraction of movement, barely visible, and Simon's body disagreed completely with the idea of standing. He went down harder, shoulder dropping, palm slapping the floor. Not punched, not kicked, not touched with anything resembling rage. Dismantled. Gasps moved through the VIP section in a slow wave, the sound of people recalibrating what they thought they'd just seen. Because what they'd watched hadn't looked like a fight. It had looked like correction. Like something being returned to its proper place. The music was still playing. Pedro crouched. Not dramatically. He lowered himself to Simon's level, the way a man crouches when he wants to be heard clearly. His forearm rested across his knee. His expression hadn't changed once, not when he'd walked across the room, not when he'd applied the lock, not now. He placed his shoe gently on Simon's wrist, not crushing, just present. Just enough to communicate that the decision about what happened next belonged entirely to one person in this exchange. And it wasn't Simon. Who sent you? Simon's jaw tightened. His breathing was ragged not from pain alone, but from the particular humiliation of a man whose entire self-image had just been restructured in front of a room full of witnesses. He was the security. He was the one people moved for. He was the one with the shirt and the title and the physical presence that had always been enough. None of it had mattered, not a single pound of it. Who sent you? Pedro asked again. Same tone, same volume, completely unhurried. Simon clenched his teeth. Pedro applied the smallest fraction of additional pressure. The sound Simon made wasn't a scream exactly. It was the involuntary release of a man whose body had overruled his pride. His free hand came up, pointed. Toward a table near the back of the room, 3 men sitting with bottle service and careful expressions, watching the way people watch things they've set in motion from a safe distance. Pedro looked up slowly. He recognized the faces. Of course he did. He stood. Released Simon's wrist completely. No ceremony, no final word of warning to the man on the floor. Simon had already received everything he needed to receive. What came next had nothing to do with him. Pedro straightened his jacket. He turned toward Bianca. For one moment, just one, something moved across his face that wasn't control or calculation or quiet authority. Something human. Something that reminded the people close enough to see it, that underneath everything this man had built, underneath every layer of discipline and restraint, there was something he genuinely could not afford to lose. He reached out and touched her face briefly with the back of his hand. She caught his fingers, held them for exactly 1 second. I'm fine, she said quietly. He nodded once, then he turned toward the table at the back, toward the men who had paid for all of this, toward the people who had just made the mistake of reminding him what happened when someone reached for what was his. He walked forward, still calm, still controlled. And somehow that the calmness, the control, the complete absence of visible fury was the most terrifying thing anyone in that room had ever witnessed. 3 hours earlier, Simon Davila had been a good man. That's the part nobody would think to mention afterward. Not the club owner who terminated him. Not the staff who watched him go down on one knee on the VIP floor. Not the people who would repeat the story for years, always starting with the bouncer who grabbed the wrong woman as though that single moment was the only thing he'd ever been. 3 hours earlier, Simon had arrived for his shift early, had straightened his security shirt in the bathroom mirror, had thought about the rent he was behind on, and the call he hadn't returned from his mother, and the quiet, grinding pressure of a life that never seemed to have quite enough room in it. He wasn't a villain. He was just a man who needed money badly enough to stop asking the right questions. The flashback arrives the way guilt always does, not all at once, but in pieces. It had started near the bar. Simon was 40 minutes into the shift change, still learning the layout of this section, still mapping faces to tables, when the man appeared beside him. Not aggressive, not obvious. Just a man in a dark jacket ordering a drink and letting his eyes move across the room with the practiced patience of someone who had done this before, who had learned that the right moment to approach someone was never the moment that looked like an approach. He had short-cropped hair and a lean, angular face with the kind of stillness that didn't come from peace. It came from discipline, from years of operating in rooms where the wrong expression at the wrong moment could cost you everything. He set his drink down and spoke without turning his head. New on this floor? Simon glanced sideways. Tonight, yeah. The man nodded slowly. Looked toward the VIP section. That woman at the corner table. Red dress. He paused. Someone important would like to meet her. You bring her over quietly. Everybody's happy. Simon said nothing immediately. The man reached into his jacket and placed a folded envelope flat on the bar between them. Didn't push it. Didn't gesture toward it. Just left it there the way people leave things they already know will be picked up. Simon looked at it, looked away. "She's a VIP guest," he said. "I know what she is." "Then you know I can't just—" A second fold of bills appeared on top of the first. The man's expression didn't change. "Bring her. She'll come." Simon stared at the bar. He thought about the rent, about the phone call he hadn't returned, about the particular exhaustion of a life that asked everything from you and handed back just enough to keep asking. He told himself it was simple. Just an introduction. Just walking someone 20 feet across a room. He told himself the woman would be fine. He told himself a lot of things in the 30 seconds before he picked up that envelope. Back on the floor of the VIP section, Simon pressed his palm flat against the cold tile and tried to breathe. His wrist throbbed. Not broken, he knew what broken felt like, but the memory of that lock was still firing through his nervous system like an alarm that didn't know how to shut off. He had felt his body become a mechanism in someone else's hands. Had felt all that size and training and physical confidence become completely, humiliatingly irrelevant in under 5 seconds. He sat up slowly. The crowd had pulled back into its own conversations the way crowds do, processing, absorbing, already converting what they'd witnessed into the version they would tell later. A few people still watched him from the corners of their eyes. A cocktail waitress passed nearby without looking at him directly, which was somehow worse than if she had. Simon looked at his hands. The envelope was still in his jacket. He became aware of this the way you become aware of something that has always been there but has only just revealed its true weight. He hadn't even opened it yet, hadn't counted it, had just taken it and tucked it away and walked toward that table, telling himself the story people tell themselves when they've already made the decision and just need the words to catch up. Now those words felt very far away. From across the room, Pedro's eyes found the table. 3 men, dark jackets, bottle service they weren't drinking. The practiced stillness of people pretending not to watch something they had set in motion. Pedro recognized them the way you recognize a problem you've been expecting, not with surprise, but with the particular weight of confirmation. The rival crew, the one that had been threading itself through the edges of his operations for weeks, moving quietly, buying influence in places they had no business being, testing corners of his city as though testing a locked door, waiting for one of them to give. And now this, they had come into his club, his room, had paid his security man to put their hands on his fiancée as a demonstration, a message dressed up as an incident. "We can reach what you love. We can touch the edges of your world. We are closer than you think." Pedro understood the language. He had spoken it himself, once, a long time ago. What they hadn't accounted for, what people who studied power from the outside always failed to account for, was that a man who has held something for long enough stops being afraid of people who reach for it. He simply becomes very, very clear about what reaching costs. One of the 3 men met Pedro's eyes across the room. He looked away first. They always did. Pedro stopped at the edge of their table. He didn't signal his men yet. Didn't raise his voice. Didn't touch anything. He simply stood there, suit jacket straight, collar open, the tattoos on his hands visible against the neon light, and let the silence do what silence does when the right person is holding it. The man who had looked away looked back. Pedro studied each face slowly, deliberately. The way a man reads a contract he already knows contains something wrong and is simply deciding where. Then he pulled out a chair and sat down. "You should have ordered something worth drinking," he said quietly, "if you were going to go to all this trouble." Nobody at the table spoke. Good. That meant they already understood what kind of conversation this was going to be. Nobody at the table moved. That was the first thing Pedro noted, the particular stillness of 3 men who had spent the last 60 seconds quietly reassessing every decision that had led them to this chair, this table, this moment. The kind of stillness that wasn't confidence, that wasn't composure. It was the stillness of people who had just realized the room they thought they were controlling had been someone else's room the entire time. Pedro leaned back in the chair, unhurried. He rested one tattooed hand flat on the table between them, not threatening, just present, and let his eyes move across each face with the same measured patience he brought to everything. The man directly across from him was the one who'd spoken to Simon at the bar. Pedro could tell by the way he held himself the slight forward lean of someone accustomed to initiating, the practiced stillness that wasn't quite practiced enough to hide the tension underneath it now. To his left, a younger man, thinner, eyes that kept moving toward the exit, and then forcing themselves back. To his right, the oldest of the 3, heavy through the jaw, gray at the temples, the kind of face that had seen enough to know when a situation had turned irreversibly. The oldest one knew. Pedro could see it. He'd already made his calculations and arrived at the number. "You paid my security to put his hands on my fiancée," Pedro said. Not a question. Not an accusation requiring confirmation, just a fact, laid on the table beside his hand. The initiator, the lean one, opened his mouth. Pedro watched him select and discard 3 different responses in the space of 2 seconds, before settling on the one people always settle on, when they have no real ground left to stand on. It was a misunderstanding. It wasn't. 2 words. No heat. No volume. The lean man closed his mouth. Pedro's men entered from 3 points simultaneously, not running, not drawing attention. They simply appeared the way water finds the low points in a room, filling the exits and the edges without announcement. 2 near the corridor, 1 at the bar, 1 stationed behind the rival table with the particular relaxed posture of someone who could stand there all night if necessary. The youngest of the 3 rivals saw them first. His hand moved toward his jacket. Don't. Pedro didn't look at him. His eyes stayed on the initiator. Whatever you're reaching for, the math doesn't work tonight. The hand came back to the table. The oldest man exhaled slowly through his nose. He picked up his untouched glass and set it down somewhere else. A small gesture that somehow communicated complete surrender more clearly than words could have. Pedro looked at him. You understand already, Pedro said. It wasn't a compliment. It was just an observation. The old man nodded once. Then you can explain it to them later. The initiator tried one more time. Because men like him always did, men who had built their confidence on the belief that the right words at the right moment could restructure any situation. That talk was its own form of leverage. We're businessmen, he said. His voice had found something closer to steadiness. Same as you. We're not here for conflict. We're here because there's space in this city that isn't being used properly. That's all this ever was. A negotiation. Pedro looked at him for a long moment. You negotiated by putting your hand in my house, he said. By paying someone to drag my fiancée across a room. That was a demonstration. Pedro said the word the initiator had been carefully avoiding. You wanted me to know you could reach what I value. You wanted me unsettled. He paused. How is that working for you? The initiator said nothing, because the answer was evident to everyone at the table. Pedro wasn't unsettled. He was here, sitting, calm, with the measured, unhurried presence of a man who had absorbed the demonstration and was now simply deciding what came after it. That was the part they hadn't planned for. You've been moving through my operations for 6 weeks, Pedro said. His voice dropped lower, and somehow that made every word land harder. Supply lines in the Eastern Quarter. The Forelli contract. The Medina arrangement. You thought I didn't see it because I didn't respond to it. He let that sit. I was letting you move, he said. I was watching where you went, who you spoke to, who you thought you were buying. You handed me 6 weeks of intelligence and called it strategy. The youngest man's jaw tightened. The initiator's eyes flickered just slightly. Just once, with the specific expression of a man who has just understood that the game he thought he was playing had different rules than the ones he'd been given. The oldest man stared at the table. He'd already known, or suspected, and had come tonight anyway, because when you're embedded in something this far, the moment you understood you'd lost, and the moment you could actually stop, were rarely the same moment. You don't operate in my city, Pedro said. Not the Eastern Quarter, not the Forelli contract, not anything you've touched in the last 6 weeks. You pull back fully, and you do it quietly, and you do it quickly, and you take with you every person you've brought into this. Silence. The bass from the dance floor pulsed through the walls. And the girl? Pedro said. The word landed differently. Quieter. More dangerous. You never look at her again. You never send anyone near her again. If I ever have cause to connect your names to her name in any context, in any room, for any reason, the conversation we're having tonight will feel like hospitality. The initiator nodded. Then the lean man. Then the youngest. The oldest had already nodded before Pedro finished the sentence. Pedro stood. He straightened his jacket with 2 small pulls at the lapels. He looked at each of them one final time, not with contempt, not with triumph, just with the steady, clear-eyed expression of a man who had said exactly what needed to be said and expected it to be received exactly as it was intended. Finish your drinks, he said, then leave. He turned from the table. His men fell into position without a word, not escorting aggressively, just present, just visible, just enough. The rivals didn't speak. They reached for their glasses with hands that weren't entirely steady. And Pedro walked back across the room toward the woman in the red dress, who was standing near the VIP railing, watching him return with an expression that held something deeper than relief, something that looked remarkably like pride. The club kept moving. That was the strange thing, the beautiful, indifferent thing about a room like this. It absorbed everything. The confrontation at the VIP table. The rivals standing slowly, gathering themselves with the careful dignity of men trying to lose gracefully in public. The quiet repositioning of Pedro's men back toward the edges of the room. All of it folded into the music, into the lights, into the ongoing business of a night that had never stopped for any of it. Within 4 minutes, it looked like nothing had happened, but the people who had been close enough to see the ones at the nearest tables, the waitress who had frozen mid-pour, the bartender who had watched Simon go down and never quite returned his expression to neutral, they carried it differently now. You could see it in the way they held themselves, the way conversations resumed at slightly lower volumes, with slightly more careful eyes. The room remembered even when it pretended not to. Bianca was standing near the VIP railing when Pedro came back. She hadn't returned to the table, hadn't reached for her champagne, or straightened her posture into the composed performance of someone who was fine. She was just standing, one hand resting lightly on the railing, the city lights bleeding purple and blue through the high windows behind her, watching him walk across the room toward her. She had watched the whole thing, the table, the rivals, the conversation she couldn't hear but didn't need to. She had watched Pedro sit down and talk and stand up and leave, and not once, not for a single visible second, lose the thread of himself. She had been grabbed tonight, handled, moved against her will by a man twice her size in a room full of people who watched it happen, and she was not falling apart. That was the thing about Bianca Rachel that people consistently underestimated. They saw the red dress and the elegance, and the fact that she arrived beside Pedro Salas, and they constructed a particular kind of story about who she was and what she required. They assumed fragility dressed up as poise. They were always wrong, but standing here now, watching him return, watching the calm in his face that she knew from years of knowing him, was not the absence of feeling but the absolute governance of it. She felt something move through her chest that had nothing to do with strength or composure, or any of the qualities she'd spent years building into armor. It was simpler than that. It was just love. The specific, lived-in love of a woman watching a man she chose continue to be exactly who she chose him for. Pedro stopped in front of her. For a moment he just looked at her the same way he'd looked at his hand on her face in the seconds after Simon went down, like he was taking inventory of something he couldn't afford to lose. "You're not fine," he said quietly. "I'm fine," she said. "Bianca." She held his eyes. Then, slowly, the architecture of her composure shifted, not collapsed, just softened, the way a room changes when someone finally opens a window. "My hands were shaking," she admitted, "when he grabbed me. They don't shake." Pedro nodded once. He reached out and took both her hands in his, turned them over, held them. They were steady now, had been steady by the time he'd crossed the room. She had steadied them herself, the way she always did, through sheer insistence, through the refusal to let her body narrate a story she hadn't chosen, but they had shaken, and she had let him know. That, between them, was its own kind of intimacy. They sat back down at the table, not because the night demanded it, but because leaving immediately would have meant something neither of them wanted to mean, would have looked like retreat, would have handed the room a story that ended with Pedro Salas walking his shaken fiancée out into the night. So they sat. A fresh glass arrived without being ordered. The music shifted into something slower. The lights overhead moved through their colors with the patient indifference of lights that had illuminated 1,000 nights, exactly like this one. "You were calm," Bianca said. "I'm always calm." "Not always." She glanced at him sideways, the ghost of something wry moving at the corner of her mouth. "I've seen the other version, not in a room full of witnesses." She smiled then, a real one, small and private and not intended for anyone else in the building. That's the part that scared him, all of them. They expected something they could respond to, rage or aggression or something with a shape they recognized. Pedro turned his glass slowly on the table. "If I lose control, they win. The moment I become emotional, I become predictable. Predictable means beatable." Bianca was quiet for a moment. "You scared him," she said. "The bouncer. He didn't understand what happened to him." Pedro shook his head slightly. "He understood enough. He'll spend a long time understanding the rest." "Is that mercy or punishment?" He considered this with the same unhurried seriousness he brought to everything. "I think," he said finally, "it's education." 30 minutes later, the club owner appeared. A compact man in his 50s, silver-haired, wearing the expression of someone who had been briefed on the situation and had spent the intervening time constructing the most comprehensive possible apology. He arrived at the table with 2 senior staff members behind him, and the particular posture of a man who understood that what had happened tonight was connected to his name in ways he needed urgently to address. Mr. Salas, he clasped his hands. I want to personally assure you that what occurred tonight is completely unacceptable. The staff member involved will be— Sit down, Pedro said. The man sat. Your mistake isn't him, Pedro said. He made his choice. Your mistake is who you allowed to influence him. He let the words settle. Someone moved through your operation tonight and used your own security against a guest in your building. That's an access problem. That's a vetting problem. That's a problem that begins long before any envelope changes hands. The owner nodded rapidly. You're absolutely right. I'll conduct a full review. I know you will. Pedro said it without threat, just certainty, because you understand what it means that this happened here, and you understand what it would mean if it happened again. The owner left 5 minutes later, with the expression of a man who had received a lesson more valuable than any reprimand and was already thinking about how to act on it. Pedro and Bianca sat in the quiet that followed. The neon moved across her face in slow waves, purple, then blue, then the warm amber that arrived just before midnight, and stayed. Ready? He asked. She reached for his hand on the table. Almost, she said. And they stayed another 20 minutes because the night was theirs, and no one had taken that from them, and they both understood, without saying it, that leaving on their own terms was the final thing that mattered. 40 minutes after leaving the club, the 3 men sat in the back of a black sedan moving through the city with no particular destination. Nobody had suggested where to go. Nobody had spoken since the doorman held the exit open, and the night air hit their faces, and the sound of the club dissolved behind them into the ordinary noise of a city that had no idea what had just happened inside one of its rooms. The initiator, whose name was Rael, sat in the front passenger seat staring through the windshield at the street ahead. His jaw was set, his hands were in his lap. To anyone passing on the sidewalk, he would have looked like a man simply riding in a car. Inside, he was conducting a very quiet, very thorough autopsy of the last 3 hours. It had been his plan. That was the part burning lowest and hottest beneath everything else. Not the humiliation of the exit, walking out of a club under the implied escort of men who didn't need to touch you to communicate what would happen if you didn't move. Not the image of Simon Davila on the floor before Pedro had even finished walking across the room. Not the conversation at the table, Pedro's voice level and unhurried, dissecting 6 weeks of carefully constructed strategy with the detached precision of a man explaining something obvious to someone slow. All of that burned. But what burned underneath it, the coal beneath the flame, was that it had been Rael's plan. He had designed it, had pitched it to the other 2 as elegant, as psychological, as the kind of move that didn't leave fingerprints because it used someone else's hand. Send someone to grab the woman, not to harm her, just to reach her, just to demonstrate proximity, just to show Pedro Salas that the edges of his world were thinner than he believed. Elegant. He pressed 2 fingers against his mouth and stared at the road. He knew, the youngest one said from the back seat. His name was Pharaoh, 26 years old, lean through the face, the kind of young that still believed the primary resource in any conflict was nerve. He'd been the one whose hand had moved toward his jacket when Pedro's men appeared at the perimeter of the table. The one who had stopped because Pedro, without looking at him, had simply said, "Don't," and somehow that single word from a man not even looking at him had been more immobilizing than any physical threat. That still bothered Pharaoh more than he wanted to admit. He knew before tonight, Pharaoh continued. The supply lines, the Forelli contract, he listed them. He's been watching us move for 6 weeks and said nothing. He said plenty, the old man said from beside him. The old man's name was Brandt. He was 53. He had been in operations like this one for longer than Pharaoh had been alive, and he had learned at significant personal cost over the years to recognize the particular atmosphere of a room when the balance of power had shifted irreversibly. He had recognized it tonight approximately 30 seconds after Pedro sat down at their table. He had spent the remainder of that conversation doing quiet mathematics. He let us move, Brandt said. He gathered information. And then when we escalated to something personal, something that involved her, he responded. Not with force, not publicly. Privately, surgically. He paused. That's not a man reacting. That's a man who was waiting for us to hand him the right moment. Silence filled the car. Pharaoh turned to look out the window. The city moved past in amber and shadow. Rael spoke for the first time. We escalate. Brant turned his head slowly. We escalate, Rael repeated. His voice had found something harder than it had held in the club, the particular hardness of a man whose pride had become more load-bearing than his judgment. He gave us a warning. Fine, he's made his position clear. But if we pull back now fully, quietly, the way he told us to, we don't just lose the Eastern Quarter. We lose everything we've positioned for the last 8 months. Every contact, every arrangement, every open door. He finally turned to look at Brant. We can't absorb that. We can't absorb the alternative, Brant said. You don't know that. Rael. Brant's voice was quiet and final. I've sat across from men like Pedro Salas before. Not often, but enough. And the one thing I've learned is that when a man like that gives you terms, when he sits down and tells you exactly what he wants and exactly what the consequences are and does it without raising his voice, you take the terms. He held Rael's eyes. Because the alternative isn't a counteroffer, it's a demonstration. Pharaoh said nothing. His knee was moving up and down against the seat, in the small unconscious rhythm of someone trying to discharge anxiety through motion. Rael turned back to the windshield. The city kept passing. One more move, Rael said finally. Not the woman, not anything personal. One business move, one play that costs him something he can't ignore. His voice had dropped lower. Something that makes him negotiate instead of dictate. Brant looked out his own window. He had been in enough rooms, enough cars, enough late-night conversations that ended with someone saying one more move to know what those words almost always preceded. He had seen the math work out badly enough times to understand what Pharaoh was too young to know and what Rael was currently too proud to accept. But he was tired, and he had always been better at reading rooms than winning arguments, so he said nothing. Across the city, in a different kind of quiet, Simon Davila sat on the edge of his bed in a small apartment 3 floors above a laundromat and stared at the envelope he'd finally removed from his jacket. He hadn't opened it yet, hadn't counted it. He just sat with it on his knee and thought about the moment his body had stopped belonging to him. The moment all that size and training and physical certainty had become completely irrelevant inside the grip of one controlled hand. He set the envelope on the nightstand. He didn't want to touch it anymore. He lay back and stared at the ceiling and thought about the look on the woman's face when she'd said, "Let go of me," clear and unafraid. The voice of someone who had never expected to need to say it twice. He thought about the look on Pedro's face when he'd walked through that door. And he thought about the fact that that man, with everything he clearly was and everything he clearly commanded, had chosen a wrist lock over a war, had chosen a lesson over a punishment. Simon stared at the ceiling for a long time. Outside, the city moved on without him. And somewhere in the back of his chest, beneath the bruised pride and the throbbing wrist and the acute, the specific shame of a man who had been publicly reduced by someone half his size, something small and reluctant began to shift. Not understanding. Not yet. But the first quiet edge of it. Pedro didn't sleep until 4 a.m, not because the night had unsettled him. Not because the rivals or Simon or any piece of what had happened inside that club was still running unresolved through his mind. He had resolved it. He had sat down and said what needed to be said and stood up and walked away, and that, in his world, was how things ended. He didn't sleep because Bianca had. She'd fallen asleep somewhere around 2, still dressed. One heel dropped on the floor beside the bed. Her hand open against the pillow, the way hands go when the body finally stops performing composure and just rests. He'd sat in the chair across the room and watched her breathe in the quiet dark, and thought about her voice saying my hands were shaking with the particular steadiness of a woman confessing something she'd already defeated. She never said things like that. In 4 years of knowing her, of building something with her that existed in the complicated overlap between love and empire, she had never once volunteered a moment of vulnerability that she hadn't already resolved. It wasn't pretense. It was architecture. She had constructed herself with the same intentionality Pedro had constructed everything else in his life, and he respected it the way you respect something that took real work to build. But she had told him her hands shook, and that sat with him in the dark until 4 a.m, when he finally stopped sitting with it and let himself sleep. He was at his office by 9. The building was unremarkable from the outside, mid-rise, commercial, the kind of address that appeared in no interesting documents and attracted no interesting attention. Inside, on the 6th floor, it was something else entirely. the kind of space that communicated authority without announcing it. Dark wood, clean lines, a view of the city that on clear mornings showed you everything Pedro had spent 15 years assembling from the ground up. His lieutenant was already there when he arrived. Rafael was 41 years old, compact and precise, with the kind of face that gave nothing away in rooms where giving things away was expensive. He had been with Pedro for 11 years, had started as a driver, had demonstrated over time a quality Pedro valued above almost everything else in the people around him. Not loyalty. Loyalty was common. Almost everyone was loyal when things were going well. Rafael was loyal when things weren't. He had a coffee waiting on Pedro's desk, and a folder open beside it. He stood when Pedro entered, not from ceremony, but from the habit of a man who understood that attention was its own form of respect. "The rivals left the city last night," Rafael said. "Two of them, the old one and the young one. Flight out at 6 this morning." Pedro sat. "Rael?" "Still here." Rafael's expression didn't change. "Checked into a hotel on the north side. Hasn't made contact with anyone we know of." Pedro looked at the city through the window. "He's not finished." "No. He'll make one more move, something he thinks is clean enough to give him leverage." Pedro turned from the window. "Watch what he touches. Don't move until I say." Rafael nodded. He closed the folder, opened it again to a different page. The Forelli contract. They attempted to formalize their position in writing while they were still operating. The document was drafted 3 weeks ago. Does Forelli know what he signed? He knows what he was told it was. Pedro was quiet for a moment. He picked up the coffee and held it without drinking it. "Set a meeting with Forelli for tomorrow. Afternoon. Bring him the actual language. He won't take it well." "No," Pedro agreed, "but he'll understand it. And understanding it will make him considerably more useful to us than he's been operating as someone else's asset." He finally drank. "Fear fades. Remind me to tell him that." Rafael almost smiled. "Almost. I'll put it in the agenda." The morning moved through its business with the steady rhythm of a well-maintained machine. 3 calls, 2 decisions. One problem in the Western Quarter that had nothing to do with the rivals, and everything to do with a man who had confused Pedro's patience for permission, a confusion Pedro corrected through Rafael in 4 sentences that would be relayed word for word because Rafael understood that the words mattered as much as the message. By 11, the industry news had reached the office the way industry news always reached it, not through formal channels but through the quiet, specific network of people who understood that information. Delivered early and accurately was its own form of currency. Simon Davila had been terminated. The club had processed the paperwork that morning. Officially, it was a conduct violation. Unofficially, everyone in every room connected to that industry already knew the fuller version. The bouncer who got bought. The bouncer who grabbed the wrong woman. The bouncer who went down in 5 seconds in his own VIP section. Rafael mentioned it without inflection. Pedro set down his coffee. Who pushed for the termination? Management initiated it. Apparently the owner had a conversation last night that clarified his priorities. Pedro nodded slowly. He thought about Simon on that floor, the size of him, the particular humiliation of a large man reduced efficiently and publicly. He thought about what that did to a person, what it cost. "He won't work security again," Pedro said. It wasn't satisfaction. It was just the accurate forecast of how these things moved through an industry that ran on reputation and word of mouth. Rafael said nothing. He recognized the register of Pedro's silences by now could distinguish between the ones that were simply processing and the ones that carried something heavier. This one carried something heavier. "He was a man who needed money," Pedro said finally. Rafael looked at him. That's all he was. He wasn't sent to that floor because he was dangerous or connected or capable of real damage. He was sent there because he was accessible. Because someone identified a pressure point, financial, personal, whatever it was, and applied money to it. Pedro looked at the city again. The rivals didn't use a weapon last night. They used a person. Rafael considered this. Does that change anything? It changes how I think about it. Pedro turned back to the desk. Not what happened, just what it means. He pulled the folder toward him. The real war was never in that club, he said. The club was a message. The war is in the contracts and the contacts and the 6 weeks they spent moving through things they had no right to touch. He opened the folder. That's where we finish it. Rafael sat down across from him, and they got to work. Rael had always believed that the difference between men who won and men who lost, was the willingness to move when everyone else had stopped. He told himself this at 7 a.m, standing at the window of his hotel room watching the city begin its day. Brant and Pharaoh were gone. He knew that. Had known it before Raphael checked the flights, before the information moved through whatever channels it moved through, and landed wherever it landed. He had watched them pack with the quiet efficiency of men who had already made their calculations and arrived at the same number. He didn't blame them. He just didn't agree with them. The meeting had taken 2 days to arrange, not with Pedro. Rael understood that door was closed, had been closed, the moment Pedro stood up from their table and straightened his jacket with those 2 small pulls that somehow communicated more finality than any door physically shutting could have. The meeting was with Forelli. Specifically, with the document Forelli had signed 3 weeks prior, the one that formalized Rael's crew's position in a contract worth enough to restructure the balance of operations in the Eastern Quarter. If that document held, if Forelli could be persuaded to honor it publicly, it didn't matter what Pedro had said at that table. Paper had its own kind of power, legal weight, the kind of leverage that couldn't be resolved with a wrist lock and a quiet conversation. Rael had spent 2 days believing this. He spent 30 seconds inside Forelli's office, understanding why he shouldn't have. Forelli was a heavy-set man in his 60s, who had built a small empire in property and import logistics, and had spent the better part of a decade maintaining careful, profitable neutrality between the various forces that moved through his city. He was not a brave man. He was a precise one. He understood that his survival had always depended less on alliance than on positioning, on being useful enough to multiple parties that removing him cost more than maintaining him. He was already standing when Rael entered. The document was on the desk between them. Forelli didn't offer a seat. "I've had a conversation," Forelli said, "that clarified several things about this document that I wasn't aware of when I signed it." Rael looked at the paper, then at Forelli's face. He saw it immediately, the particular expression of a man who has been shown something that recontextualized everything and has already decided what it means for his next move. "Whatever you were told." "I was told the truth," Forelli said. His voice was steady with the steadiness of someone who had resolved this before Rael arrived and was simply now delivering the resolution. "The language in Section 4 binds me to exclusivity arrangements I wasn't informed of. The language in Section 7 creates liability exposure I'm not willing to carry." He picked up the document. "And the source of those arrangements isn't someone I'm willing to be formally connected to, given what I now know about your current operational standing." He held the document out. Rael didn't take it. "My operational standing," Rael said carefully, "is not what someone has told you it is." "Rael." Forelli set the document back on the desk. His voice dropped into something quieter and considerably more direct. "I've been in this city for 30 years. I know what Pedro Salas is. I know what he represents. And I know what it means when a man like that takes the time to sit with me personally and walk me through a document line by line." He paused. "It means the people who drafted that document are no longer a productive relationship for me." Rael stood very still. The room was quiet, the kind of quiet that isn't peaceful but final, the silence of a door that has just been closed from the other side. Pedro had gotten here first. Not just last night. Not just the club. Pedro had seen this move before Rael had made it, had walked Forelli through the contract language, had surgically removed the document's foundation before Rael even arrived to stand on it. 6 weeks of work, dissolved, not with force, not with threat, with information, delivered calmly, by a man who had been watching Rael move through his city and waiting for exactly the right moment to show each piece to exactly the right person. Rael picked up the document from the desk. He folded it once, and he walked out. Pedro was in his office when Raphael brought the confirmation. "Forelli meeting ended in 11 minutes, Raphael said. Rael left the building. Pedro didn't look up from what he was reading. "His hotel?" "Checked out." Raphael paused. "He's at the transit hub. Looks like he's leaving." Pedro turned a page. "Good." Raphael stayed in the doorway. He had been with Pedro long enough to know when the silence was a conclusion, and when it was still arriving at one. "You could have pushed harder," Raphael said. "Not a challenge. Just the observation of someone who was genuinely curious about the calculation. At the club. At any point in the last 2 days. The document alone could have been leveraged into something public. Something that cost them significantly more." Pedro looked up. "Fear fades," he said. Raphael waited. "If I'd destroyed Rael publicly, financially, reputationally?" "Completely. The next person who considered moving through my city would think about that outcome and decide whether the potential gain was worth the risk of the same. Pedro closed the folder. Some of them would decide it was worth it, because the thing about fear is that it calculates, it compares, it finds the angle where the numbers still work. He leaned back. But if the story is that Rael came into this city, moved against my operation, made it personal, and then quietly left with nothing, no drama, no public collapse, no war, then the story is that there was nothing to get. He looked at the city through the window. That's not fear. That's futility. And futility doesn't calculate. It just stops. Raphael was quiet for a moment. Controlled consequence, he said. Always. Across the city, Rael sat in a departure terminal, with a folded document in his jacket pocket, and the particular silence of a man who had run his calculations, and finally, reluctantly, arrived at the number Brandt had reached days ago. He thought about the moment Pedro had sat down at their table, not the words. He'd replayed the words enough. He thought about the posture, the absolute absence of performance in it. The way Pedro had pulled out a chair and sat down with the casual ownership of a man taking a seat in his own home. Rael had walked into that club believing money was the most mobile form of power, that it could be moved through walls and doors and people, and used to reach anything, anywhere, given enough of it. Pedro had shown him something else. He stared at his boarding pass, and for the first time since this had started, Rael stopped thinking about the next move. There wasn't one. Not in this city. Not against that man. His flight was called. He stood, and he left quietly, completely, in exactly the manner Pedro had specified at a table in a nightclub, while the music played and the lights pulsed, and a room full of people pretended not to witness the moment the war ended, before it ever became one. The city didn't notice him go. It rarely noticed the things that didn't happen. That was the point. Simon Davila cleaned out his locker on a Tuesday. There wasn't much in it. A change of clothes, a phone charger, a photograph he'd taped to the inside of the door when he first started his younger sister at her graduation, laughing at something outside the frame, the specific, uninhibited laugh of someone who had no idea they were being photographed. He took the photograph down carefully, folded it, put it in his jacket pocket, and walked out of the building without speaking to anyone, because there was no one left in that building who knew what to say to him, and he had no interest in making it easier for them by pretending there was. The days after the club had moved strangely, not badly, not dramatically, just with the particular altered texture of days that come after a moment that rearranged something fundamental, when the ordinary things, coffee and traffic and phone screens, all feel slightly unfamiliar, like furniture moved 2 inches from where it always was. Not enough to trip over, just enough to notice constantly. He had expected anger, had braced for it during the drive home that night, the hot, defensive anger of a man who has been publicly humiliated and needs somewhere to put it. Had expected to lie awake building the version of events where he'd been set up, where the circumstances were uniquely unfair, where any reasonable person would have made the same choice given the same envelope, and the same pressure, and the same rent sitting 3 weeks overdue. He had expected to believe that version. He hadn't. That was the thing that surprised him most. The anger came briefly, weakly, and then receded like a tide that had lost interest, leaving behind it something quieter and considerably harder to argue with. He had taken money to move a woman who didn't want to be moved. There wasn't a version of that he could construct that changed what it was. His sister called on the 3rd day. He almost didn't answer, not because he didn't want to hear her voice, but because hearing it would mean being himself, the full, unedited version, and he hadn't quite worked out how to be that yet with any comfort. He answered anyway. She didn't know about the club. He hadn't told her, and the version that had circulated through the industry hadn't reached her world, which was a different world entirely. Classrooms and lesson plans, and the specific contained dignity of a person who had built something honest with their hands and their time. She asked how he was. He said he was fine. She heard what was underneath it, sisters always did, and she didn't push. She just talked. About her students, about a parent-teacher meeting that had gone sideways in a way that made her laugh, telling it. About the small bureaucratic absurdity of a school that had lost its own photocopier key for the 3rd time. Simon sat on the edge of his bed and listened. And somewhere in the middle of her talking, somewhere between the photocopier and a story about a student who had written an essay about wanting to be a professional cloud watcher, something in his chest loosened, slightly. Not healed, not resolved, just loosened. He thought about Pedro Salas every day, not obsessively, not bitterly. With the particular, reluctant attention you give to something you don't want to learn from but can feel teaching you anyway. He thought about the wrist lock, not the physical mechanics of it, but the intention behind it, the choice behind it. A man who could have broken something, who had every justification in that moment to break something, who had chosen instead the minimum necessary force to make the maximum necessary point. He thought about what Pedro had said to him on the floor, kneeling down, eye level, voice quiet. "You let money make you disrespectful." 6 words, no rage in them, no contempt, just the flat, accurate delivery of a true thing. Simon had replayed those 6 words more times than he'd replayed anything else from that night. More than the envelope. More than the woman's voice saying, "Let go of me." More than the sound of his own knee hitting the floor. "You let money make you disrespectful." The thing was, and this was the part he kept arriving at, kept circling back to no matter what direction he approached it from, Pedro was right. Not about the technical facts of the situation, about the internal sequence of it. Simon had felt the pressure of the rent, and the envelope had appeared, and he had reached for it before asking what it cost, because he hadn't wanted to know what it cost. He had wanted the money, and he had called it opportunity, and he had walked toward a woman who said no, and decided his need was larger than her answer. That was the truth underneath everything else. And the wrist lock, the 5 seconds, the floor, the public reduction of every physical advantage he'd spent years building. None of that was the punishment. The punishment was knowing. He left the security industry. Not dramatically. Not with a declaration or a story he told anyone. He simply stopped applying for the positions that came up and started thinking about what else he knew how to do, and found, somewhat to his surprise, that there were things. His father had been a carpenter. He'd grown up in a house where things were built and repaired and maintained with the patient attention of people who understood that the value of something was inseparable from the care you gave it. He made a call, an old contact, a small construction firm on the east side that had been trying to expand its crew. The man on the phone asked if he had experience. Simon said he had some, that he was willing to learn the rest. The man said, "Come in on Monday." He sat in his apartment the night before and looked at the envelope on the nightstand, still unopened. He picked it up, held it for a moment. Then he put it in an old shoebox at the back of his wardrobe and closed the wardrobe door and didn't think about it again that night. He would figure out what to do with it, but not tonight. Tonight he ironed his clothes for the morning and called his sister back and let her finish the Cloud Watcher story she'd started 3 days ago, and laughed in the right places and felt, for the first time since the club, like a man who was standing on ground that belonged to him. It wasn't much, but it was his, and this time, nobody had paid him to stand on it. The nightclub looked the same purple ceiling lights cycling through their slow pulse, same bass rolling through the velvet couches like weather you felt before you heard, same champagne bottles arriving at tables with their brief gold explosions of light, same air cologne and ambition and the specific confidence of a room that had never stopped to consider its own fragility. Pedro stood at the entrance for a moment before walking in. He didn't do this often pause. He was not a man who lingered at thresholds. But tonight he stood there for a few seconds and let the room exist in front of him before he became part of it. Bianca's hand was in his. She felt him pause, looked up. "You're thinking," she said. "I'm always thinking. You're thinking about that night." He didn't answer immediately, which was, between them, its own kind of answer. They took the same table. The VIP section had been quietly rearranged since then. Different configuration, new upholstery on 2 of the couches, the bar restocked with better bottles. The club owner's version of an apology expressed through renovation rather than words. Pedro had noticed it the first time he'd returned and said nothing, which the owner had correctly interpreted as acceptance. The same waitress appeared. She held herself slightly differently around Pedro now, not fearful, just calibrated. The particular attentiveness of someone who had watched something happen in this room and had permanently adjusted their understanding of the room as a result. She brought champagne without being asked. Bianca thanked her by name. "Tell me what you're thinking," Bianca said. Pedro turned his glass slowly on the table. Outside the high windows, the city moved through its night light and motion, and the ongoing, indifferent business of a place that contained multitudes and noticed almost none of them. "I'm thinking about 5 seconds, he said. Bianca waited. 5 seconds is nothing. You can't build anything in 5 seconds. You can't travel anywhere. You can't change your mind, make a decision, cook a meal, write a sentence. He looked at the table. 5 seconds is the gap between floors in an elevator. It's how long it takes to read 3 lines of text. He paused. And it's enough time to show a person something they'll spend years thinking about. Bianca studied him with the particular quality of attention she reserved for moments when he was saying something that mattered, not performing listening, actually doing it. "Simon," she said. "Simon, Rael, the men at that table, the club owner, everyone in this room who was here that night." He finally looked up. "None of them will forget 5 seconds. Neither will I," she said quietly. Something moved across his face. "I know. That's not a wound, Pedro. I want you to understand that." She set down her glass. "I know what it looked like from where you were standing, walking back through that door and seeing—" She stopped. Started again. "I want you to know that what I felt first wasn't fear. It was fury. I was furious. A small, precise smile. I was about to handle it myself." He looked at her. "I know that too," he said. And the way he said it, quiet, certain, carrying in it a complete and unpatronizing understanding of exactly who she was, landed somewhere between them like something placed down gently. She reached across and put her hand over his. He thought about Rael in a departure terminal with a folded document and no next move. He thought about Brant, the old man who had known early and nodded before the sentence finished. He thought about Pharaoh, young enough to still believe that nerve was the primary resource, old enough now to know otherwise. He thought about Simon Davila, cleaning out a locker, thought about the photograph of the sister, the folded paper, the walk out of a building toward something uncertain and honest. He didn't know those details, couldn't know them. But he knew the shape of what happened to a man after a night like that one, had seen it enough times to understand that the floor of a VIP section was sometimes the beginning of something, rather than just the end. He hoped that was true for Simon. He genuinely did. "Was it worth it?" Bianca asked. He considered the question with real seriousness, not performing consideration, actually sitting with it. The rivals are gone. The contracts are restored. Forelli understands his actual position. The people who needed to understand what reaching into my world costs, they understand it. He looked at her. "So by any practical measure, yes. That's not what I asked." He was quiet. "The bouncer," she said. "The envelope. A man who needed money badly enough to stop asking the right questions. Was any of that worth what it cost him?" Pedro looked at the table for a long moment. "No," he said. "It wasn't. The lesson he needed didn't require a public floor." He turned his glass. "But I couldn't give him a private one, because the message wasn't only for him." "I know. That doesn't make it—" "I know," she said again, softer. "I'm not asking you to justify it. I'm asking if you think about it, every time I come back here." She nodded once. Like that was exactly the right answer. Like the thinking about it was the thing that mattered, the thing that separated controlled consequence from mere dominance. They stayed until the club reached its quiet hour. Not late enough to close, but late enough that the energy shifted, the aggressive brightness of peak hours settling into something looser, warmer. People leaning into conversations instead of performing them, the music dropping half a register. Pedro and Bianca didn't talk the entire time. Not because there was nothing to say, but because they had reached the particular comfort of two people who had been through something together and come through it without losing each other, and could now simply exist in a room without needing to fill it. When they finally stood to leave, Pedro paused at the edge of the VIP section. He looked at the floor, the exact spot. Bianca stopped beside him. She followed his eyes, looked at the same unremarkable stretch of polished floor that looked like every other stretch of polished floor in the room. 5 seconds, she said. 5 seconds, he agreed. She took his arm. They walked out together through the club past the tables and the bar, and the entrance where a new security man held the door with practiced neutrality, and out into the city air, which was cold and clean and indifferent in the way that cities are always indifferent, always moving, always generating the next moment before the last one has finished meaning anything. On the pavement outside, Bianca looked up. "Power isn't what you do to people," Pedro said. She waited. "It's what you choose not to do." She looked at him for a moment. Then she leaned her head briefly against his shoulder, a small, private gesture that belonged to no one else. They walked to the car. The city moved around them, loud and bright, and entirely unaware. And somewhere inside that building, in a room full of lights that never stopped pulsing and music that never stopped playing, 5 seconds continued their quiet work, echoing. Long after the night that made them. Thanks for sticking with this story until the very end. You're the reason these stories feel alive. If you're ready for another powerful journey, just tap the next video on your screen. And before you go, leave a quick comment and rate this story from 1 to 10. I'm excited to read your thoughts and connect with you in the comments.